Now that we have our database management system set up, let's take a look at what we need to do to be able to connect to it from a PHP script. Here in this video, I want to just start off basically by doing a little bit of configuration to get my DBMS ready to have PHP connect to it, and then go through the basic steps of how we're going to have PHP actually do the connection. That'll also give us an opportunity to be able to test and make sure that everything's actually working the way that it should. I'm going to go ahead and start off here in my Workbench tool, and I'm going to connect to my local MySQL installation. Let me go ahead and click on localhost here. It may at that point ask you for your password, in which case go ahead and just type it in. And one of the very first things that I want to go ahead and do while I'm here in the Workbench is I want to create a database that we can work in while we are practicing with our PHP scripts. I've cleaned out all the databases that I had in here previously so that I'm starting off rather fresh, hopefully very much like yours is. And down here underneath where it says schemas is where any databases you have should be listed. What I'm going to do to create a new database is there's a button up on the toolbar that looks like 3 stacked disks. I'm going to click on that, which will tell it I want to create what they're calling a new schema. That's essentially a new database. And I'm going to tell it I want to create a database called PHP. You know, uppercase sometimes bothers me. I think I'll do lowercase PHP, and that ought to be it. Down at the bottom of your screen then, there should be a button that says Apply. I'm going to go ahead and click mine, even though it's a little out of frame here. It'll then come up and show you the little bit of MySQL code that it's actually going to write on your behalf in order to create that new database. So there it's going to create schema PHP. Again, I'm going to click apply. That executes that SQL code, and we should over here on the side now have a PHP database that shows up. You might notice right now that that PHP database is sort of in a normal weight font. That means the database exists, but we're not actually focused on using it. Whenever we're going to work in the Workbench with that particular database, what you're going to want to do is double click on it. At that point, the database will show up in bold. When it's in bold, that means that any commands we type, like the SQL will do here in a little while, all of that will actually take place against that PHP database at that point. Let me go ahead and close up that tab where I just created that database. I don't need it anymore. Now that I do have a database, the second thing that I want to do is I want to create a user account that can access that database. Well, why not just use the root account, the one that I use to log in here? Well, whatever user account I'm going to use to connect to my database from PHP is going to have to actually be written into a PHP file somewhere. And I would really prefer to not have the overall master password and username for my entire database server be written down anywhere. What I would prefer to do is instead have a special purpose user account that can only access this one database, and even that only to a limited extent. That way, since I have to write that username and password into my PHP files, if those files ever become compromised, it will only be this one database that's compromised, not the entire server itself. So it's much safer that way. To create this special purpose user, I'm going to come up to the section here on my sidebar that says Users and Privileges. It then has a list here of all of the users that I currently have. Again, down a little out of frame, there should be a button that says Add Account. If I go ahead and click that Add Account button, it starts a new sheet over here where I can then create a new user account. I'm going to tell it I want to create a new user called PHP_user. You can technically name it whatever you'd like. That just seems sensical to me. And then you can put in whatever you want the password for this user to be. I'm going to use MC427 again because it's what I know I won't forget. Although a better password, a stronger password, and definitely a password that's different than your root password would be best here. Once you've given your new user account a name and given the passwords, you can click the Apply button, which is down towards the lower right-hand corner of your screen. That should go ahead and then add that user to the list of users that you have available. And what we would want to do next then is we would want to take that user and give them access to the database we created. To do that, I'm going to click on the user, come over and choose Schema Privileges, the tab here. With that user selected then, I'm going to click Add Entry, and I'm going to tell it I want to select a schema that that user will have access to. So I'm going to come down, choose Selected Schema, PHP, that's the PHP database I just created, and click OK, and that then gets added to the list of databases that this user is going to have access to. The many checkboxes that are down below then determine what that user is going to be allowed to do with that database. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to say this user only has the ability to select, insert, update, and delete. Basically the 4 fundamental actions we need to be able to do CRUD. I'm not going to give that user any other capabilities. So again, if that username and password should be compromised, this will help mitigate the damage that could be done. Once I have my checkboxes selected near the lower right-hand side of your screen, there should again be an apply button. Go ahead and click that, and you should be good to go. At that point, we now have a database that we can work in. We now have a user that we can use to connect to that database. The database itself doesn't actually have any tables in it, but to be able to do our little connection test, we don't actually need any tables, just the database itself. So that's enough to get us started for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the workbench at this point, and I'm ready to actually try now writing some PHP code. There are lots of different ways that you can have PHP potentially connect to databases. Lots of different libraries, lots of different databases make for quite a combination of different possibilities. PHP generally is able to connect to most any database management system that you might come across nowadays. And very often PHP might have even more than one way to be able to connect to each one of them. The particular way that's been most popular lately, and what I'm going to show you here in these videos, is a PHP library called PDO. PDO stands for PHP Data Object. It's another one of those pesky recursive acronyms. But it's gotten to be a very common way of being able to access databases from PHP. Certainly one of the big advantages of it is that the PDO syntax doesn't change depending on the database that you're using, depending on your database management system. So if I start off with MySQL today and I'm writing PHP code using this PDO library to do it, and I change to a different database management system tomorrow, say, I don't know, Oracle or something like that, then theoretically, because of the PDO library, I would not need to change any of my actual PHP code. The PDO library abstracts away the differences between the different databases. So what I want to do here is I want to start by just first of all looking at how we can use PHP's PDO library to be able to connect to a database. For starters, the PDO library is object-oriented. So what I would actually want to do for starters is to create a PDO object. So I would say new PDO. Now this is of course PHP code, so I'd want to put that inside some PHP tags. Normally this would also be a part of an overall page of whatever it was I was going to do. But like I said, all I really want to do in this particular case is just see if I can connect, and that's the end of it. I'm actually doing this work in a file I've already created named dbtest.php. So here I'm going to be creating a new PDO object. That new PDO object is going to return to me a resource, basically an object that represents my connection to the database itself. So I'll have a variable there to hold that. And when I call the constructor for the PDO library, that's PDO. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the D and the O sometimes. When I call the constructor, I need to pass it some information. For starters, I need to tell it as part of a string what type of library, what type of database I'm connecting to. So I'll say MySQL : and then I need to tell it where that database is actually located. In this case, my database is actually on the same computer as PHP, so I'll set host equal to localhost. The next thing I need to tell it then is I need to tell it the name of the database on that server that I want to access. So I do that by saying dbname equals, and then the name of my database is PHP. That's the first string that I need to give it. Tells it what type of database management system it is, where it is, and what to connect to on it. The next argument I then need to give it is the name of my user account. So I created a user account called PHP user. And then the third thing I need to tell it is the password that I set. I set the password to MC427. So using that username and password, the PDO library will try to connect to a MySQL server running on localhost, and on it it'll try to access a database called PHP. Well, how do we tell if it works or not? We could go ahead and pull that up in our web browser if we wanted to. And when I pull it up in my web browser, this is what I see. Absolutely nothing. So did it work? Did it not work? It's a little hard to tell. One of the things you can do with the PDO library is you can ask it to tell you about any errors that occur in the form of thrown exceptions, like we've talked about previously. The way I tell the PDO library that I want to do this is on my database object, the PDO object that I created, there's a method I can call called setAttribute. This setAttribute method is passed different constants from the PDO class. So I'm going to start by passing it PDO : attr underscore, that's attribute, error mode, ERRMODE. So essentially what I'm doing with that is I'm telling the PDO object that I want to set an attribute called error mode, and then what I actually want to set it to is another constant, PDO : error mode underscore exception. Kind of a cryptic sort of line, but essentially what that line boils down to is that I'm telling the PDO object stored in the DB variable that anytime there's any kind of problem, what I want it to do is I want it to throw an exception. By throwing an exception, I can catch that exception and from it determine if anything has gone wrong. So let me modify my script here just a little bit more. I'm going to put an echo statement in here. I'm going to have it output the word connected, ... Let me also go ahead and put this entire thing into a try-catch block. And the kind of exception that I want to catch is a custom exception that comes along with the PDO library called PDO exception. So I'll say catch a PDO exception, put it into a variable called E, and then if anything goes wrong, I'm going to say echo the word problems. And then after problems, what I'm going to do is I'm going to echo from my exception object whatever I get back when I call getMessage, which is a method that's a part of the exception class. So it should be supported there by that PDO exception object. If I jump back over to my browser now, refresh, it says connected. So no exception was thrown, so the best I can tell at this point, we are successfully connected to the database. Let me shut down my database management system so that we can see something actually go wrong. There, off screen, I have shut down my database management system now, and now if I hit refresh in the browser, it comes back and tells me problems, SQL state, no such file or directory. Again, a rather cryptic message, but essentially what that boils down to is couldn't find the database server. If I start my database server back up again, and now I refresh my page, it goes back to saying connected. So if everything is set up and working correctly at this point, you should be seeing hopefully close to the same thing that I'm getting here. Well, what if you're not seeing what I'm getting? What if you're doing everything the exact same way? You're positive your usernames, your passwords are correct, your database server is definitely running, you're sure of it, you can connect to it through your workbench. What else could possibly be wrong? Well, probably the most common thing to go wrong beyond simple typos is that your PHP server may not have access to the PDO library. If you're getting some kind of error message especially that says PDO class couldn't be found or undefined constant PDO, then it might be that your PHP server simply can't find that PDO library. If that happens to be the case, then most likely what you're going to need to do is to access your PHP INI file. Now, I do believe we worked with this PHP INI file back in some of the very first videos for this class when we were talking about how to actually configure our server, our PHP server initially. If you search through that file for PDO, you'll find a number of lines that look a lot like what I have right here. PHP, PDO, MySQL, PHPDO, ODBC, lots of those sorts of things. What these different lines are basically different PDO libraries that MySQL should have available to it. And there's the possibility that if you're having trouble using the PDO library, you might need to uncomment one of these lines. The way you uncomment the line is simply by removing the semicolon from the beginning of it, and the line that we would be most interested in would be the one that says PHP_PDO_MySQL. That is specifically the PDO library that lets us connect to a MySQL library. So you could remove the semicolon from the beginning of that line, and that should do the trick. If you remove the semicolon, save your PHP INI file, and then restart your server, hopefully at that point it will get you your connection to the database back again. Overall, this is going to be a very important little pattern in that every time we write a new script that we want to have access to a database from, we're going to need to go through a process similar to this where we'll actually connect to the server by creating a PDO object, set its attribute, and monitor for exceptions that are thrown. Now that we actually know how to connect to the PDO library, the next things we'll go on and talk about then are how to actually start issuing queries so we can start retrieving data and working with it.